I stood in front of the mirror, my hands trembling slightly as I traced the faint redness along my collarbone. My breath was uneven, my heart beat too fast for a simple morning routine. The sound of footsteps made my stomach twist. I pulled my robe tighter just as my husband entered the room, his expression soft, trusting. "You look lost in thought," he said with a warm smile, stepping behind me and pressing a kiss to my shoulder. His reflection in the mirror showed nothing but love, obliviousness. I forced a chuckle. Just thinking about today's plans. I turned to face him, meeting his gaze for just a second too long, before retreating to the bathroom. Once the door clicked shut, I exhaled, gripping the sink. I needed to compose myself. I needed to forget. But the problem was, I didn't want to. It had all started so casually, so innocently. My life had been steady, predictable, comforting. My husband and I had built a life that others envied. A beautiful home, shared laughter, quiet evenings that felt safe. But safety could be suffocating. And that suffocation had crept in unnoticed, disguised as routine, as stability, until I barely felt the rush of excitement anymore. Then he arrived. The first time I saw him again after years, I thought nothing of it. A polite greeting, a small embrace, nothing out of place. But something had shifted. He wasn't the boy I had once known. He carried himself with a confidence that made me uneasy, that made me too aware of the way his eyes lingered. I remember that evening. We had dinner together. My husband, his son from a previous marriage, and me. He was charming, effortlessly so. The way he leaned back in his chair, the way he met my eyes across the table, the way his lips curled at the corners when I looked away too quickly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but my body registered it before my mind did. Later that night, as I lay beside my husband staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the sensation. The feeling of being watched. Admired. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a trick of my own dissatisfaction. But the next morning it was there again. He was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, coffee in hand, a smirk playing on his lips. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "Morning," I replied, reaching for a mug. "Sleep well?" The question was harmless, but the way he asked it wasn't. I hesitated before answering, pouring my coffee as if the movement could shield me from the weight of his gaze. "Fine." I turned to leave, but he stepped slightly into my path. Just enough that I had to adjust my direction. Just enough that the space between us felt too small. "Good," he murmured. And then just like that he stepped away, leaving me standing there with a cup of coffee growing colder in my hands. It was the first move in a game I hadn't realized we were playing. That afternoon my husband asked me for a favor. His son needed a ride into the city and I was free. I agreed without thinking. The car ride was quiet at first. The distant hum of the radio, the steady rhythm of the tires on asphalt. Then his voice cutting through the silence. "You seem different." I kept my focus on the road. "How so?" He shrugged. "I don't know. More tense. More aware." I let out a small laugh, forced and hollow. "You're imagining things." "Maybe," he said, but there was amusement in his tone, as if he knew something I didn't. At a red light, I glanced at him. He was watching me, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You look good," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The light turned green and I had never pressed the gas so fast. I should have said something. I should have corrected him, set a boundary, made it clear that this wasn't a conversation we could have. But I didn't. Because for the first time in years I felt something new. Something dangerous. Something I couldn't name, but I knew it had teeth. When we reached our destination, he unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't get out immediately. Instead he turned toward me. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice lower now, more intimate. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel. "Of course." His fingers brushed against mine as he reached for the door handle. A fleeting touch. Accidental perhaps. But the way he smiled before stepping out told me it wasn't an accident at all. And as I watched him disappear into the crowd, I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The tension was subtle at first, like a whisper against the back of my mind, easy to ignore if I tried hard enough. And I did try. I spent the next few days convincing myself that nothing had happened, that nothing was happening. But denial has a way of making things sharper, more pronounced. It made me hyper-aware of every interaction, every glance, every pause in conversation that stretched just a little too long. And he knew it. He carried himself with a quiet arrogance, a confidence that bordered on dangerous, because it wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that waited, that pulled people in without effort. It was the kind that made you lean in before you even realized you were doing it. I found myself thinking about that car ride more than I should have. Replaying the moment his fingers brushed mine. The way his voice dropped an octave when he said my name. It was ridiculous, really. A passing moment, nothing more. But then why did my stomach tighten every time I heard footsteps approaching a room, hoping, dreading, that it would be him? I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting distraction. A harmless curiosity. And then my husband asked me to drive him again. It wasn't a request, not really. More of a casual mention over breakfast, a since you're already going that way kind of favor. I hesitated for only a second before agreeing. What else could I have done? Refused? Acted as though I was afraid of being alone with him? That would have made it real. That would have meant acknowledging something I wasn't ready to face. So I went. The car ride started the same as the last. Quiet, the hum of the engine filling the silence between us. But this time I felt it differently. I felt his presence beside me like a tangible thing, something that pressed against my skin, that stole the air from my lungs. And then without warning he spoke. "You're avoiding me." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "No, I'm not." A small chuckle. "You are." I didn't respond. Because what was there to say? That he was right? That I had been taking longer routes through the house just to make sure we didn't cross paths? That I had been making excuses to stay busy, to keep myself occupied so my mind wouldn't wander to places it shouldn't? I felt his gaze on me, studying, assessing. "It's okay," he said after a pause. "I get it." There was something in the way he said it, calm, assured, that sent a ripple of irritation through me. "You don't get anything," I snapped before I could stop myself. Another chuckle, deeper this time. "If you say so." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to focus on the road. He was playing with me. I knew it. And worse, I was letting him. The rest of the drive was quiet, but not in the way it had been before. This was different. It wasn't the absence of conversation. It was the presence of something else. Something unspoken, something thick and heavy that sat between us, waiting. When we arrived, he unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't move to get out. Instead, he turned to me, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh. "You know, I don't bite," he said, amusement laced in his voice. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Good to know." His smirk widened. "Unless you want me to." A rush of heat spread through me before I could stop it. A mixture of shock and something else, something I refused to name. Before I could respond, he was already opening the door, stepping out with the kind of effortless ease that made it seem like he had all the time in the world. "See you around," he said over his shoulder. And then he was gone. I let out a shaky breath, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I needed to get a hold of myself. I needed to stop this before it turned into something more. But deep down I already knew. It was too late. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I tried to push the thoughts away, to drown them in the comfort of familiarity. But my body betrayed me. My skin was too aware, too restless. And the worst part? I wasn't thinking about the man beside me. I was thinking about his son. The way he looked at me. The way his voice dipped just enough to send a shiver down my spine. The way he smiled like he already knew how this story would end. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing sleep to take me. But the truth settled heavy in my chest. I had let the first crack form. And cracks never stay small. They spread. They grow. Until they break everything apart. I woke up feeling heavy, as if my body was carrying a weight that had settled deep in my bones overnight. My husband was already out of bed, his side of the mattress cool, the sheets neatly folded back. The smell of coffee drifted in from downstairs. A quiet reminder of normalcy, of routine. I went through the motions, shower, dress, light makeup, but everything felt mechanical, detached. I avoided my reflection, not wanting to see the evidence of restlessness in my eyes, the slight flush that still lingered on my skin from a dream I wished I could forget. But reality had a way of catching up with me. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, he was already there, leaning casually against the counter, a coffee mug in his hand. He looked relaxed, comfortable in a way that felt almost mocking. As if he knew. As if he had been waiting for me to walk in, just to watch me struggle to maintain composure. My husband sat at the table, reading the news on his tablet, oblivious to the silent tension that stretched between us. "Morning," he said, not looking up. I murmured a greeting, keeping my voice steady as I moved toward the coffee maker. And then, as if the universe wanted to test my restraint, I felt it. A presence behind me, close enough that the warmth of his body seeped into my skin before he even touched me. But he did. Just the lightest brush of his fingers against the small of my back as he reached past me for the sugar jar. It was innocent, accidental even. At least that's how it could have been interpreted. But we both knew better. I stiffened, but I didn't move away. I should have. I should have reacted, should have made it clear that there was a line, that it had to remain uncrossed. But I didn't. And he knew that too. I turned, coffee in hand, and forced a smile, ignoring the way my pulse thrummed at the base of my throat. He met my eyes with something unreadable, something dark and knowing, before he took a slow sip from his cup. My husband was still distracted, flipping to another article, completely unaware of the silent war taking place in his own kitchen. I needed to get out of there. "Hey," my husband said suddenly, looking up. "Could you drop him off again today? I've got a meeting and it's out of the way." I froze for half a second before forcing myself to nod. Of course. His son smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was the kind of expression a person wore when they knew they were winning. The drive felt longer than usual. Or maybe it was just me, just the unbearable awareness of his presence beside me, of the silence that was thick with everything unspoken. I could feel him watching me, but I refused to look at him. "You're quiet today," he finally said, his voice low, smooth. I tightened my grip on the wheel. "I don't have much to say. That's new." I ignored him, focusing on the road ahead. But he wasn't done. "You know," he mused, his voice laced with amusement, "it's kind of funny how much effort you're putting into pretending this isn't happening." My breath caught, my fingers clenching around the leather steering wheel. "There is no this," I said firmly, though even I could hear the slight waver in my voice. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "If you say so." The rest of the drive was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was charged, filled with a tension that had its own weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I should have felt relieved when we finally arrived, when he unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the door handle. But then at the last second he turned back, leaning slightly toward me. "One of these days," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper, "you're going to stop pretending." And before I could even process his words, before I could react, he did it. A kiss, quick, fleeting, but deliberate. Just the brush of his lips against my jaw, close enough to my mouth that my breath hitched, but not close enough to be a full betrayal. Not yet. Then he was gone, stepping out of the car as if nothing had happened. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I should have been angry. I should have felt disgusted, should have wiped the sensation away the moment he left. But I didn't. Because the worst part, the part one couldn't even admit to myself, was that for a split second, I had leaned into it. I had wanted it. And I had no idea how to come back from that. I spent the rest of the day convincing myself that it hadn't happened. That it wasn't real. That it had been a misunderstanding, a trick of my own restless mind. But the heat of his lips still lingered against my skin, a phantom touch that I couldn't erase no matter how many times I ran my fingers over the spot, willing it to disappear. And the worst part was, I didn't want it to. I went through my usual routine, forcing normalcy into every moment. I folded laundry. I answered emails. I smiled when my husband came home and asked about my day, nodding in all the right places as he talked about work. I made dinner, washed dishes, sat beside him on the couch as he scrolled through a documentary, his hand resting absently on my thigh, warm, steady, familiar. But my mind wasn't there. It was back in the car. Back in that moment. Back in the way my breath had caught, the way my body had frozen, the way my pulse had stuttered when his lips brushed against my skin. I barely registered my husband's voice when he spoke. "You okay?" I blinked, forcing myself to focus. "What? You've been quiet all night." I forced a small smile, shaking my head. "Just tired. Long day." He nodded, accepting my answer without question, pressing a brief kiss to my forehead before turning his attention back to the screen. I exhaled slowly, relieved and ashamed all at once. I went to bed early, claiming exhaustion, but sleep never came. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. And then, at some point in the middle of the night, I did something I knew I shouldn't. I slid my fingers across my skin, tracing the spot where he had kissed me, closing my eyes as a shudder ran through me. The next morning I told myself that I would avoid him. That I would set boundaries, put distance between us. But he had other plans. I walked into the kitchen expecting to find only my husband. Instead, I found him sitting at the counter, a coffee mug in hand, watching me with the same unreadable expression he always wore. My pulse skipped. I hesitated for only a fraction of a second before forcing myself forward, pretending he wasn't there, pretending everything was fine. "Morning," my husband said, barely looking up from his phone. "Morning," I murmured, reaching for the coffee pot. I felt him watching me. I didn't have to look to know. "You two are driving together again today, right?" my husband asked casually. I froze. My grip tightened around the handle of the pot. "Right," he answered for me, amusement in his voice. I turned, my expression carefully blank. "I have some errands to run after. I might not have time." "Come on," he said, smirking slightly. "Don't make me take the bus." I hated that my stomach twisted at the way he said it, at the way his voice dipped just slightly, making something as simple as a ride sound like something else entirely. My husband glanced up briefly, oblivious. "It'd be easier if you just dropped him off. You're already heading that way." I didn't have an excuse. I nodded stiffly. "Fine." His smirk widened slightly as if he had won something. Maybe he had. The car ride was different this time. The silence wasn't just thick. It was suffocating. Every breath felt too loud. Every shift in my seat felt too obvious. I gripped the wheel tighter, staring straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the way my body felt too aware of his presence. "You're mad at me." His voice was smooth, calm, unbothered. I exhaled through my nose. "I'm not." "You are." I didn't answer. Pause. And then, "You liked it." My breath caught. My hands tensed around the wheel. "You don't have to admit it," he continued, his tone almost casual. "I already know." My heart was pounding now, loud, deafening. "I don't know what you think happened," I forced out, keeping my voice steady, "but it didn't." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure. Whatever helps you sleep at night." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I hated him. I hated him for knowing exactly what to say to unravel me. For making me feel things I shouldn't feel. For looking at me like he saw through every single lie I told myself. For making me want him. I pulled up to the curb faster than necessary, my knuckles white around the steering wheel. "Get out." He didn't move right away. Instead, he leaned in just slightly. Close enough that I could feel the heat of him, close enough that my body reacted before my brain could stop it. "You want me to leave?" he murmured. "Say it like you mean it." I turned to glare at him, but I had made a mistake. I had turned too quickly. And suddenly our faces were too close. Our breaths mixed. His eyes flicked to my lips for the briefest second and my stomach clenched. I could end it here. I could push him away, make it clear that this was the last time we would ever be alone together. But I didn't move. Because a part of me, the part one had been trying to bury, was waiting. Waiting for him to kiss me. Waiting for me to let him. And that terrified me more than anything. I should have pushed him away. I should have said something sharp, something that would remind him who I was, who he was, who we both were supposed to be. But I didn't. I sat there, my breath uneven, my pulse a frantic drum against my ribs, my body betraying every ounce of reason I still had left. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He was waiting, testing me, giving me the space to make the choice he already knew I wouldn't. Because he had seen it, he had felt it. The hesitation. The way my body had stilled. The way I had turned too quickly, too eagerly, landing inches from his lips. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't desperate. He was in control as he had been from the start. The weight of it pressed against my chest, suffocating. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. My throat was too dry to respond, my body too tense to move. And then, just as suddenly as he had leaned in, he pulled back. Not in retreat, not in surrender, but as if to remind me that it was my turn now. That he had already done his part and now it was up to me. The space between us stretched, and I gasped for air as if I had been holding my breath for too long. "See you soon," he said before stepping out of the car, shutting the door behind him as if he hadn't just set fire to everything I thought I had under control. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that I was still the one in charge. I wasn't. That night, my husband wrapped his arms around me in bed, his body warm against mine, safe and familiar. I let myself relax into his touch, closing my eyes, willing my mind to stay in the present. But the ghost of another touch lingered. A phantom whisper of breath against my skin, a voice that had settled in the deepest part of me, knowing it had found a home there. I should have felt guilty. Maybe I did. But not in the way I was supposed to. Because it wasn't the thought of betrayal that made my stomach twist. It was the fact that I wanted more. The next day I told myself I wouldn't see him. I would avoid him, stay busy, drown myself in errands and phone calls and the comforting routine of my life. But fate had other plans. I was in the kitchen when he walked in, casual as ever, as if nothing had changed, as if we weren't standing on the edge of something irreversible. My fingers tightened around my coffee mug, but I didn't look at him. "Morning," he said. I ignored him. A small chuckle. "So, we're pretending again?" I turned, finally meeting his gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about." He smirked, stepping closer. "Sure you don't." The air between us crackled, charged with something that had been simmering for too long. I swallowed hard, gripping the counter behind me, needing something solid to hold on to. "You should leave," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. He tilted his head, studying me. "Do you want me to?" I hated him for asking. Hated him for knowing the answer. The moment stretched, unbearable. And then, just when I thought he would say something else, he stepped back. Not because I had told him to, not because he had lost interest, but because he knew that retreating now would make it worse. Would make me want to follow. Would make me crave the chase. "See you around," he said, and then he was gone. I let out a shaky breath, pressing my palms against the counter, trying to ground myself. This was getting dangerous. But the truth was, it already had been. From the start. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. I told myself I could stop this. That if I ignored it, if I pretended hard enough, it would disappear. But desire doesn't just disappear. It lingers, it festers, it waits. And the more you deny it, the stronger it grows. I avoided him. I buried myself in routine, in obligations, in the familiar touch of my husband, who held me every night without question, without doubt. And still my thoughts betrayed me. Still I found myself searching for him in the smallest moments. In the way my skin prickled when I walked into a room, in the way my breath hitched at the sound of approaching footsteps, in the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near, even if I refused to look at him. But he never pushed. That was the worst part. He let me play my little game of avoidance, let me convince myself that I was in control. He didn't seek me out, didn't force my hand. And that made it worse. Because it meant that when I finally broke, it would be my fault. And I did break. It happened the way all dangerous things happen. Suddenly, inevitably. It was late. The house was quiet. My husband had gone to bed early, and I had lingered downstairs, pretending to be busy, pretending that the weight pressing against my chest wasn't what I already knew it to be. I should have gone upstairs. I should have gone to bed, crawled into my husband's arms, buried myself in the comfort of his warmth, his steadiness. Instead, I found myself outside on the back patio, staring into the night, gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles ached. I heard him before I saw him. The soft creak of the door, the quiet footsteps approaching. I should have left. I should have walked away, gone inside, locked the door behind me. But I didn't. "You can't keep avoiding me forever," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. It slid through me like warm silk, wrapping around my ribs, pulling tight. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "I'm not avoiding you." He laughed, soft, knowing. "You are." I didn't turn around. He stepped closer. I felt him before I saw him. The warmth of his body, the quiet intensity of his presence. My hands gripped the railing harder, as if that alone could anchor me. "You don't have to be afraid," he murmured. "I'm not afraid." Another chuckle. Liar. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart slamming against my ribs. "You should go inside," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Pause. And then, "Tell me to leave and I will." I hesitated. Too long. Too late. He stepped behind me, close enough that I could feel his breath against the back of my neck, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, that maddening warmth that had haunted me for weeks. My voice broke and I hated myself for it. He didn't move. Didn't touch me. He didn't have to. The air between us pulsed, thick with everything unspoken, everything restrained. And then finally I turned. Slowly. Carefully. His gaze met mine, dark and unreadable, and I knew he wouldn't make the first move. He never would. He was going to make me do it. He was going to make me choose. And I did. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. Maybe it didn't matter. Because the moment our lips met, the moment his hands found my waist, the moment I melted into him with a desperation that I couldn't even name, there was no going back. No more pretending. No more denying. No more escape. I was his. And he knew it. I told myself it was just one mistake. That it wouldn't happen again. That I could pretend it had never happened at all. But shame and desire are two sides of the same coin, and once you flip it, you never know which side it will land on. I barely slept that night. I lay awake beside my husband, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, my body still humming with the aftershock of what I had done. My lips still tingled from his kiss. My skin still burned where his hands had gripped my waist. And worst of all, I didn't feel regret. I felt hunger. A deep, aching hunger that I had spent too long suppressing, one that had been waiting for the smallest crack in my resolve to slip through. And now that it had, it wouldn't leave. The next morning I avoided him. Or at least I tried to. I stayed in my room longer than usual, taking my time getting ready, fixing my hair, reapplying my lipstick. I stared at my reflection, searching for some trace of the woman I had been before last night. She wasn't there. By the time I went downstairs, he was already there. Sitting at the counter, drinking his coffee, looking as effortless and composed as ever. As if nothing had changed. But I had changed. I gripped the edge of the counter, my fingers digging into the cool surface, my pulse hammering against my ribs. He didn't look at me right away, but he knew I was there. He always knew. "Morning," my husband said, walking past me to grab his briefcase. He pressed a kiss to my cheek, a touch so familiar, so expected that it felt like muscle memory. "I'll be home late," he added. "Don't wait up for me." I nodded, my throat dry. And then he was gone. The silence he left behind was suffocating. I didn't move. Neither did he. It stretched between us, thick and heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. And then finally he spoke. "You're avoiding me again." I exhaled sharply, gripping the counter harder. "I'm not." "You are." I turned to face him, narrowing my eyes. "What do you want from me?" His lips curled slightly as if he found my frustration amusing. "I think you already know." I hated that he was right. I hated that I had been the one who crossed the line first, that I had been the one who turned, who kissed him, who let my body press into his like it belonged there. But most of all, I hated that I wanted to do it again. "Last night was a mistake," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He tilted his head, studying me. "Then why are you still here?" I clenched my jaw. "Because I live here." Not what I meant. I swallowed hard, looking away. "I'm not doing this with you." Soft chuckle. "You already are." I should have walked away. I should have left the room, locked myself away, done anything but stand there and let him unravel me with nothing but his words, his presence. But I didn't move. Because he was right. I was already his, whether I wanted to be or not. And the worst part? I wanted to be. I tried to tell myself it was over. That I had made a mistake, but mistakes could be erased, buried beneath routine and normalcy. But the body remembers what the mind wants to forget. And my body remembered everything. The heat of his touch. The weight of his lips against mine. The way my pulse had stuttered, not with fear but with need. I threw myself into distractions. I spent more time out of the house, running errands that didn't need to be done, taking the longest routes home, lingering in grocery store aisles just to delay walking back into that space, into his presence. But avoidance is a flimsy shield, and the longer I tried to wield it, the weaker it became. Because he wasn't avoiding me. He didn't need to. He knew I would break first. It happened 3 days later. I had just come home, setting my purse on the kitchen counter, already planning to head upstairs before he could walk in, before I had to see him. But he was already there. Leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with that same unreadable expression. I should have kept walking. I should have pretended I didn't see him, gone upstairs, closed the door behind me. But I was tired of pretending. Tired of running. Why, I stood there. Waiting. He pushed off the doorway, stepping toward me. Slowly. Deliberately. I didn't move. "Still pretending?" he asked. I exhaled slowly, forcing my body to stay still, forcing my hands not to shake. "I don't know what you want me to say." He smirked, shaking his head. "You don't have to say anything." I swallowed, my throat dry. "This is dangerous." He stopped a few feet from me, close enough that the space between us felt too small, too charged. "Then why aren't you leaving?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. Because I didn't have an answer. Because I didn't want to leave. I hated myself for it. But not enough to step away. His gaze flickered over my face, lingering on my lips. Tell me you don't want this, he murmured. I didn't. Because we both knew I was a liar. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers barely skimming my skin. A simple touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine, a slow unraveling of every defense I had tried to build. I should go, I whispered, but I didn't move. His lips curved slightly. You won't. He was right. And when his hand slid to the back of my neck, when he pulled me toward him, when our mouths met for the second time, I knew I was never going to stop this. Not until it destroyed everything. And maybe not even then. I don't remember when I stopped fighting. Maybe it was the first time our lips met in the dark, when my body answered before my mind could protest. Or maybe it was later when I caught myself staring at him across the room, waiting, aching, for the next stolen moment. But at some point the war ended. And I lost. It wasn't just the moments when we were alone. It was the way my world shifted around him, the way everything else faded into the background when he was near. The way my body responded before my thoughts could catch up. I had convinced myself that I could control it, that I could pull away when I needed to. That I could stop this before it went too far. But I had already gone too far. And I wasn't the only one who noticed. She had been watching me. I didn't realize it at first. Or maybe I did, but I told myself I was imagining things. It was little things at first. The way her eyes lingered when I spoke, the way her expression changed when I mentioned him in passing. But it wasn't until later that I knew for sure. We were in my living room, drinking coffee, our conversation drifting aimlessly between topics, when she set her cup down and gave me a look that made my stomach drop. You've changed, she said. I forced a small laugh, shaking my head. What does that mean? She tilted her head slightly, studying me. You tell me. I looked away, pretending to check my phone, pretending that her words weren't clawing their way beneath my skin. I don't know what you're talking about. A beat of silence. Then, it's him, isn't it? The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. My throat tightened. What? She sighed, shaking her head. Don't do that. Don't act like I'm imagining things. I gripped my mug tightly, the ceramic warm against my skin. You're wrong. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Am I? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her gaze. You don't understand, I said quietly. She exhaled, sitting back. I understand more than you think. Something in her voice made my stomach twist. She wasn't angry. She wasn't judging me. She was worried. That was somehow worse. You need to stop this, she continued. Before it gets worse. I almost laughed at that. Worse. It was already worse. It was already everything. I set my mug down carefully, standing up, ignoring the way my hands shook. I think you should go. She didn't argue. She just sighed, grabbing her coat. Before she left, she hesitated in the doorway. You think no one will find out, she said quietly. But secrets don't stay secrets forever. And then she was gone. Her words haunted me for the rest of the day. I told myself she was wrong. That she had no proof that I could still make this right. But paranoia has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. That night, I lay awake next to my husband, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. I told myself I could fix this. That I could stop. But deep down I knew. The damage was already done. And it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart.